There are many ways that we can define trauma. There are dictionary definitions. There are the more subjective definitions of what trauma means to you. And then there are clinical definitions that don't have a diagnostic criteria, such as developmental trauma. And then there are the more formal diagnostic definitions, which have strict criteria that need to be met. And in this video, let's have a discussion about that set of formal diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Now, we immediately run into a bit of an issue with this. And that issue is that we actually have two sets of diagnostic criteria we can refer to. One is the International Classification of Diseases, currently on its 11th revision, and that's produced by the World Health Organization. This is often referred to as the ICD, or the ICD-11. Secondly, there's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is currently on the 5th edition, which is produced by the American Psychiatric Association. And this is commonly referred to as the DSM, or the DSM 5. Broadly speaking, the DSM is used in the United States of America, and the ICD is used everywhere else. Now, I know that 50% of my viewers are from the US, so they would use the DSM, and I live and work in the UK, where we tend to use the ICD. So you can end up in this strange situation where you meet one set of criteria and not the other. So this just shows how difficult it is to capture human experience and apply a diagnostic label to it, or a set of diagnostic criteria to it. However, the purpose of this video is to take a look at that diagnostic criteria. So what I'm going to do is split this video into two parts. One part is going to be for the DSM criteria and the other part for the ICD criteria, because they are different. So let's get started with the DSM. This set of diagnostic criteria applies to people over the age of 6. And it's split into 8 different sections or criteria, which are denoted to the letters A to H. So let's start with criterion A. So A, there must be exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So you directly experience the traumatic event. In other words, it happened to you. Then we have witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others. So you saw it happening to someone else. A third way is learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend. And the fourth way it could happen is experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of a traumatic event. So think here about vicarious trauma. Think here about professionals who might be exposed to details of abuse over and over again. So they haven't been abused themselves, but they're seeing material or they're hearing about it from victims and survivors. And there's an additional note here for this fourth part, and that's the exposure cannot be through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures unless that exposure is work-related. So if you're watching horror movies, for instance, as entertainment, then that wouldn't count here, no matter how terrifying they are. And then we have criterion B, and this gets a little wordy, so I'm going to try my best to explain it in non-clinical terms. There must be present one or more of the following intrusion symptoms associated with the traumatic event or events, beginning after the traumatic event occurred. So this is the part where we start to think about re-experiencing or reliving the event. So 1, recurrent, involuntary and intrusive distressing memories of the event or the events. So recurrent meaning that it repeatedly happens. And it's involuntary, meaning that you don't purposely bring it to mind. It just comes to you. And when that happens, it causes you distress. Okay, the second on the list is recurrent distressing dreams in which the content are related to the event. Okay, so nightmares about what happened. Third on the list are dissociative reactions, where it feels as if the event is recurring. So we sometimes refer to this as flashbacks. The fourth is intense, prolonged psychological distress and exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the event. So this is usually when people talk about being triggered. So if something reminds you of the event, whether that reminder is something that is external to you, like a person or a place, or if that reminder is internal, so it could be a thought that you have. And when you have that reminder, you experience psychological distress, then you would meet this criteria. And the fifth one is a marked physiological reaction to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. So this is really similar to the previous one, but instead of it being psychological distress, it causes distress within the body. So this could be activating a fight or flight response when something reminds you about what happened. So that's criterion B. Remember, you just need one symptom from that list. Moving on to criteria C, and this is all about avoidance. And there's only two things to consider here. One, that there is avoidance or there are efforts to avoid. So you try to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about things that are closely associated with the event. And number two, avoidance or efforts to avoid. So again, you try to avoid external reminders, such as people, places, conversations, activities, objects, and situations. So essentially, you either avoid or try to avoid anything that reminds you about what happened. So that's criterion C. You just need one of them. So criterion D, and this section is all about cognition, so the way that we think, and it's about our feelings, so the way that we feel. And there's 7 things in this list, and you have to have 2. And these 2 things must have started or got worse since your experience, since the event. And these 7 things are: 1, the inability to remember an important aspect of the event. And this is due to the nature of the event itself. It's not due to alcohol or drugs or some form of head injury. So it's more around dissociation from the event, which has impacted your memory. So at the time it happened, you dissociated, and now you can't remember a lot about what happened. Secondly, we have persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about yourself, other people, or the world. Then we have persistent distorted cognitions, so thoughts that you're having about the cause or the consequences of the event that lead you to blame yourself or others. So you're taking a lot of responsibility for what happened, or you're putting a lot of responsibility on other people. Then we have persistent negative emotional state. So you get stuck in certain feelings and emotions. You get stuck in feeling fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. And you have diminished interest or participation in significant activities. So in other words, there's a kind of a depressive element. You've lost interest in what you used to enjoy doing or things that were important to you. And then you have feelings of detachment or estrangement from others, from other people. And the persistent inability to experience positive emotions, such as the inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. So you need 2 of those things. Criterion E then looks at alterations in arousal or reactivity, and sometimes we describe this as hyperarousal. And again, you need 2 of the following: irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation. And this is typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or towards objects. Reckless or self-destructive behaviour. Hypervigilance. An exaggerated startle response. Problems with concentration. Sleep disturbance, such as difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or having restless sleep. And that's it for that criteria. Again, 2 of them. So those are the main components of the diagnostic criteria. The next few parts are around how long this has been experienced for and the impact it has on your daily functioning. So criterion F says the duration of the disturbance must be more than 1 month. Criterion G then says the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupation, or other important areas of functioning. In other words, it has an impact on your day-to-day life. And criterion H says that this disturbance is not due to something else, such as substance misuse, so drugs, prescribed medication, or alcohol, and it can't be explained better by another medical condition. And that's what we have for the DSM. That is the criteria to meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So to summarize just more briefly than what we've just been through, there's been exposure to actual threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. There are intrusions such as memories or nightmares that cause physical or psychological distress. There is avoidance or attempts to avoid reminders of the event. There are changes in mood and cognitions. And there's an increase in arousal and reactivity. And this goes on for more than a month. It causes a significant distress or impairment of function, and it cannot be explained by something else. Right, now let's take a look at the ICD-11 diagnostic criteria. So if you work with me in the UK, if you're part of my service, if you're one of my clients, then this is the criteria that we use when we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. So the ICD-11 diagnostic criteria is fairly similar to the DSM-5, but there are some differences that are important. So firstly, there needs to be an exposure to an event or a situation that the ICD calls of an extremely threatening or horrific nature. Now the ICD, it does give some examples of what these events might look like. So this isn't an exhaustive list, these are just examples. And those are directly experiencing natural or human-made disasters, combat, serious accidents, torture, sexual violence, terrorism, assault, so being assaulted, or acute life-threatening illness, like having a heart attack. Or if you're not directly experiencing that yourself, there needs to be witnessing the threatened or actual injury or death of others in a sudden, unexpected, or violent manner. Or there's learning about the sudden, unexpected, or violent death of a loved one. And then the ICD goes on to say that there needs to be the following core components that last for at least several weeks. And those core components are re-experiencing the traumatic event in the present. So people generally refer to this as flashbacks. The event is not just remembered, but is experienced as if it's occurring right now in the present. And usually this is in the form of vivid, intrusive memories. So intrusive being the memory just comes. You haven't purposely tried to recall it, it's just popped into your head. And it comes as a memory or an image. And this can vary from being somewhat mild, so this is more of an intrusive memory, and you have an idea that it is a memory and it's happened in the past, to the more severe end, where there's complete loss of awareness of present surroundings. And this may also occur as repetitive dreams or nightmares that are related to the event. And usually when this re-experiencing takes place, it's accompanied by strong or overwhelming emotions such as fear or horror, and strong physical sensations like a fight or flight response. And re-experiencing can also involve feelings of being overwhelmed or immersed in the same intense emotions that were experienced during the traumatic event, and may also occur when there are reminders of the event. So this is what people often refer to as being triggered. And there's a note here in this criteria, and that is that it isn't enough to remember how you felt at the time. You actually have to be feeling that way in the present. So you can't have the memory and say, when this happened, it made me feel fear at the time. You have to be feeling the fear in the present when you think about the event. So re-experiencing is one of those 3 core components that we often talk about. The next core component that is addressed is avoidance. So deliberate avoidance of reminders likely to produce re-experiencing of the event. So some people refer to this as trauma reminders. Again, some people refer to this as things that might trigger them. And this might be active internal avoidance of thoughts and memories related to the event. So when you have a thought or a memory, you try to push it away, you try to distract yourself, you're trying not to have it, you're trying to avoid that thought as much as you possibly can. Or it could include external avoidance of things like people, having conversations around certain topics or the event that happened. Could be avoiding activities or situations that may remind you of the event. And then the third core component is a perception of heightened current threat. For example, hypervigilance. So that's always being on edge, or having an enhanced startle response to things like unexpected noises. And if you are hypervigilant, you may be constantly guarding yourself against danger and feel that you are, or people close to you are under some form of immediate threat. And this might be seen in behaviours like scanning a room when you first enter, not sitting with a back to the door, repeated checking of the rearview mirror in your car. So those are the 3 core components. You've got re-experiencing, you have avoidance, and you have hypervigilance. So they're the same as that middle set in the DSM V criteria. And these have to persist for several weeks and result in significant impairment in personal, in family, in social, in educational, in occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So in other words, it has a negative impact in one of your main life domains in some way. And for the ICD, that's it. That's the criteria to get a diagnosis of PTSD. So we've looked at the DSM 5 and we've looked at the ICD 11. And as you can see, both criteria has core components. They both have intrusions or experiencing some kind of flashbacks. They both have avoidance, and they both have a heightened arousal or hypervigilance. But the largest difference between the two is probably that the DSM includes that additional set of symptoms related to changes in thoughts and feelings, which are exaggerated negative beliefs about oneself, the world, and other people, distorted thoughts about what caused the event, having persistent negative emotions, having less interest in significant events and feeling detached or estranged from others, and finding it almost impossible to experience any positive emotions. The ICD criteria doesn't have that part. It doesn't have that component to the diagnostic criteria. And the reason for that is because the ICD has a separate diagnosis of complex PTSD, which introduces some of those elements. The DSM doesn't have a diagnosis of complex PTSD within it. We will cover complex PTSD in more detail in another video. It needs a video to itself, just so we can go over the components that have been added to PTSD in the ICD. I understand that all of what I just said sounds really clinical. It sounds like we're not really thinking about the person in this. We're using very cold, I think, clinical terms to explain some of this experience. And we've also got to be mindful that there are going to be people who just fall short of some of the criteria, but are still really struggling. And I appreciate there's also an entire debate around the use of a diagnostic model to begin with. And I'm not going to get into a discussion in this video about how important a diagnosis is, as it really is an individual perspective. For some people, it helps them make sense or offers an explanation of the experiences they have had and the way it's impacted them. It can also open up formal pathways of treatment or intervention, because quite often services are set up around a diagnosis. For others, a diagnostic label can feel stigmatizing or make someone feel as if they are seen as a set of symptoms, as a set of criterion and boxes being ticked, instead of being seen as a person. So before people mention it in the comments, I am aware at how clinical this video has been, essentially reading off a set of diagnostic criteria. But I think it's important to acknowledge this at this time and talk about this set of criteria, because there's a reality right now that this is what a diagnosis is based on. Obviously, this video isn't a way to diagnose yourself. If you are looking for some form of formal diagnosis, please speak to a healthcare professional or someone who is qualified to make that diagnosis. This is just to get you thinking to some degree about your own experience, whether any of this fits with your experience. I hope this video was useful in understanding the diagnostic criteria a bit better for PTSD. Next, we're going to be looking at complex PTSD, and then we're going to be taking a look at developmental trauma. So that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take care. Goodbye.